So today we have a workshop on cancellation of contracts following the corona pandemic by major brands and retailers and the effect on suppliers. Our instructor is Jeff Vogt, the director of the Rule of Law Department at the Solidarity Center. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you.
And so we'll go into the questions right away. From the different discussions on the platform, we had a big debate about workers losing their jobs and livelihoods as a result of the cancellations by brands and and retailers. And these occurred without negotiations on the part of the brands. And this had a big impact on the suppliers. So what we see is that due to these cancellations, in the global north, there have been instances where there is lack of certain goods as a result of the cancellations, while in the producing countries, there is not, the workers lost their jobs or others had to protest as a result of this. So one participant from Senegal referred to this and mentioned that the workers there were protesting, and there were also cases where they were destitute due to the bankruptcy of the suppliers. So it would be interesting to hear more about how workers in the garment sector and other industries were affected by the cancellations, and whether they could seek remedies against these cancellations by the brands that relied on the principle of force majeure. So could you expound more on these results, on the results of the cancellations and the responses in both the producing countries and the countries where the brands are located? Thank you. Over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Aisha, for the question, and thank you to GLUE for inviting me to this series, and thank you for those who are attending. See a familiar face from the last one, so good to see you again, Philip. So yeah, it's the Solidarity Center with Worker Rights Consortium and the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights. I think last year we produced a paper looking at this because what we were seeing was just it becomes trite now to say that COVID had exposed the kind of the weaknesses in the kind of global governance system, because I think and everybody who's working on labor rights knows all along how stacked the kind of the global legal order is for labor is against workers, right? So that it only worsened with the advent of COVID is not a big surprise. But I think it did also underscore, for all the talk we've had about corporate social responsibility or human rights due diligence or other kind of doctrines over the years, that when it came to it, when there was a real crisis, when these ideas could have been tested, they failed pretty radically, right? So what we saw at the very beginning of the pandemic, so we're talking early 2020, is that begins to be a breakdown in the supply chains of kind of fabric and other inputs coming out of China. And at the same time, once we come into kind of March, April, a number of countries start announcing lockdowns. That obviously stores are closed, people are not going outside, consumption drops, at least in person, and this sets off a reaction by the global brands and retailers to cancel or suspend or postpone orders, so that they're not, bringing, importing goods that they believe that they're unable to sell, right? So The so we took and the effect of this, of course, is once the brands are starting to cancel goods, and in some cases, goods that are already on ships, to their destination, not goods that were just planned to be made or just begun to be made, but they canceled orders that were in process and in shipment, right? So, this had obviously a knock-on effect. Once they canceled orders, the manufacturers obviously were saddled with both goods and debt, and then that led to the kind of mass layoffs of workers in the garment industry. Obviously, many of whom do not have a cushion of income from work because they're paid so low to begin with, that this then turns into a humanitarian crisis. So you have millions of workers in countries like Bangladesh that is highly dependent on the global garment industry, suddenly unemployed, and in such a situation that they have no income, no savings, and therefore, on the edge, really on the edge as far as being able to buy food and basic necessities. And in some cases, workers are thrown out of employer-provided housing and kind of other basic needs. So in the context of this, the ILO kind of meets and comes up with a framework for recovery of the sector. There's discussions with the IMF and World Bank about providing emergency relief, but in the end, and some countries do pass small payments to affected workers for a limited period of time to try to kind of create a small safety net. And kind of the lack of the safety net in the first place is also, I think, kind of one of the things that has really come out of the pandemic, of being underscored that, in many countries, that there just simply isn't a social protection scheme to deal with kind of unemployment, especially at this scale. And this also kind of calls into question this whole way in which, again, the global garment industry we'll kind of focus on the garment industry in this case. Obviously the brands and retailers aren't paying taxes where the goods are being produced, and in many cases, governments have given extended tax holidays in order to attract the investment into the country in the first place to manufacture the goods. So a lot of tax revenue, which could have supported social safety nets, weren't there or weren't prioritized. So, I mean, this as a result of all of this, we see a lot of organizing at all levels. Again, the kind of international level, the global unions and the ITUC are kind of working within the ILO and the international financial institution system around immediate relief to workers and long-term building up of social safety nets. Unions, both in the global north and global south, are working together to try to pressure brands who canceled the contracts to actually pay for the goods that were in process and shipped, so that those funds can get down to the manufacturer, which then can get down to the worker. And a number of brands, as a result of campaigning, did agree to pay for those orders. But many didn't. And of our particular interest, and we've commissioned research which is still ongoing, we wanted to look at what can workers do in this situation, right? Certainly when they were dismissed in the country in which the production was happening. Many were dismissed without, wages fully paid, with severance being paid out. So there's clearly the basis for the recovery of those wages and benefits in national level courts. Unfortunately, in many cases, we have some manufacturers going bankrupt, so there's not somebody to recover from. And in other cases, we know, I think courts are quite slow, and especially not in a place to handle such mass claims coming into the system. At the same time, we wanted to take a look at the responsibility and legal liability of the brands and retailers, because it was their actions which caused this cascade that wound up with millions of workers worldwide being without work. And in particular, whether this kind of force majeure argument, which some were arguing, really stood up. So in the brief that we produced last year, which I think hopefully is in your reading, we looked at the law in the United States and in Germany, and then kind of looked at the kind of international commercial law to the extent that it also shed light on the question. And it's typically if you're a retailer, I mean, a brand that has access to its own retail, we were finding that there weren't strong arguments, because if anybody, in our view, had a good argument that they had a force majeure event, it was the manufacturers, right? Because they were the ones that were seeing inputs from other countries drying up. They were the ones with the workforce that was potentially at high risk of illness or death. Some countries had also started imposing lockdowns, so it was understandable that the manufacturer may have a claim, but for the buyer, all they have to do is pay for the order, right? So, and just the fact that you have that a contract is not as advantageous now as when you entered into it is not a basis to void the contract, right? So otherwise, people will be walking out of contracts all the time. So, we kind of looked at this question, and then on the basis of this initial research, we've now commissioned legal research in Italy, France, Germany, the UK, and the United States. I think that's all of them. Yeah. To take a look at, was there justification was there any legal justification for what the brands did? And in Canada, there's the other jurisdiction. And if not, what are the chances that a worker, not only the manufacturer, but the workers in whichever country, could have a claim not only against the manufacturer, but also against the brand for what happened? You wouldn't be surprised that we're finding, that this will be difficult to argue, but not necessarily impossible in all places. But I think for us, part of the research was, all right, if we're able to find some way somewhere that this work, then great. Maybe we can try some test case. But if not, then it does point us to directions of where we need to change the law, so that when brands do this again, and I'm sure this will happen again, we're in a place where we have, we can advocate to change the laws so that these kind of decisions don't allow brands to kind of inflict massive harm on the rest of the world and then kind of walk away as if nothing happened. And I see my time is almost out, so I'll leave it there and be happy to take any questions on this before I think the next question.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. So the floor is open to our participants. You may ask your questions to Jeff.
I would just add, if there are no questions, I mean, I think one of the things we also realized about this is that, part of the reason we're also not seeing a lot of, manufacturers, suppliers bringing lawsuits, which you think if anybody had the ability, maybe a difficult claim for workers, but the suppliers, yes, is the obvious fact that one, the contracts that they have with the buyers are extremely one-sided, right, and create a number of legal hurdles for them to overcome. Having to sue in the courts of the buyer, using the buyer's laws, using having to pay the legal fees of the buyer if they lose, right, and on top of the practical issues is that if a supplier was ever to sue a buyer, they would never, ever see another order, right, from that buyer. And they probably wouldn't see another order from any other buyer, right? Because although there may not be any explicit collusion, I mean, they're going to be known as, oh, that's the supplier who sues buyers over their contracts. So I think they also know that it would be suicidal in a business sense to go after the brands, on top of the fact that the chance of winning are low and it's going to be extraordinarily expensive.
Okay, so still no questions. Then I'll put myself on the list. I wanted.
Ask a question?
Okay, go ahead.
So I think garments and textiles are kind of began with, the exploitation with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
And I mean, maybe I'm stating the obvious, but it seems like in the current maybe neoliberal phase and system of dispersed production, it seems like one of the original players that created this exploitative system is big retailers like Walmart. Would you say that that's still kind of have their ability to manipulate outsourcing? Has that not changed? And is this just a continuation of that pattern that had already been created? That these huge, not only brands, but just the huge retailers, and then how would the changes with kind of like online ordering like Amazon and that affect that? Is it just continuing a pattern of exploitation that has never changed? Because the other part of my question is, I thought with those big, like the Tazreen fire in Bangladesh in 2012, and then the Rana Plaza where 1,100 people got killed in the building collapse. I thought there was supposed to be more transparency and these supply chains weren't going to be nearly so exploitative, but it seems like nothing has changed. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, so I mean, these are all good questions and observations. I would say going backwards, I mean, I think has nothing changed. I think there have been some changes, but it's only, I mean, for example, I think the Bangladesh Accord, which is now the International Accord, I think did make progress. But that was progress in large part because you had a number of global brands in a panic sign on to an agreement, which had existed before Rana Plaza, that one company had signed on before. And as soon as Rana Plaza happened, then you had 200. But I mean, I think it's because both you had the agreement with kind of workers in the governance, creating space for workers at the shop floor, being empowered to talk, at least in this case, around occupational safety and health issues, which had a knock-on effect, obviously, on freedom of association generally, and that if brands failed to live up to the commitments that they made, that there was a process to sue them. And it in fact happened. There were 2 arbitrations that took place under the accord, and the unions won. So, I mean, that I think created, some very specific incentives for both suppliers and buyers to clean up, right? And so I think those factories that were covered by the accord, I think, are in a better situation, at least occupational safety and health wise, and building structure wise, than they were before. I mean, unionization in Bangladesh is still low, in large part because of an extraordinarily anti-union industry, which is captured the governments. So it's complicated, but we'll see. Your mention of kind of online shopping, I think we actually thought was one of our arguments, suggesting that the brands and retailers actually weren't as affected as they said they were by COVID, because they still had a means to sell their products without having the so-called brick and mortar stores being shut down. So people still did, during the pandemic, buy clothes, on the internet, right? So maybe not as much, obviously. They weren't going into the office or doing whatever. So consumption, no doubt, went down, but it wasn't like there was no avenue for brands and retailers to sell their goods. And on the larger structural question, I think, one of the major reasons for the supply chains being as they are today is because the brands now are really like owners of intellectual property and nothing more. I mean, they've outsourced all the production. They've done it in such a way that they were relocating production in countries that were cheaper labor, weaker labor laws, weaker labor enforcement, cheaper, and that they were insulating themselves from any legal liability that may occur in the country in which the production is happening. So all that was binding them was a contract between themselves and the supplier, and it was the buyers that basically were putting forward the contract basically without negotiation and dictating the terms. So it's not surprising that when we had a crisis like this, that it was stacked fully against the suppliers and the workers, who obviously weren't at the table to begin with.
Thanks, Jeff. So yeah, any other questions from the group? Evelyn, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the submissions. I'm just wondering, from the last submission, in terms of brands outsourcing all their production to countries where they actually have cheap labor, there's less implementation in terms of labor rights. Using the human rights due diligence regulations that are being formulated by a number of countries, I know there's a lot of progress made in the global north compared to global south. Isn't there opportunity for factoring in some of these responsibilities that are trying to shelve as brands to ensure that where there's actually a violation, and even where there's outbreak in terms of the force majeure, there's that provision or clause that can be used to actually protect the workers at that point from the perspective of human rights due diligence? I don't know how that actually works, because by the end of the day, if you don't do anything, they'll still continue hiding behind "it is not my responsibility." So do we have a way of combining the human rights due diligence as required by human rights and business principles, by UN guiding principles, to see how to mitigate some of these challenges?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, and I think that we began to address that a little bit in the paper. But yeah, I think for us, I think the what happened with the outbreak of the pandemic and these order cancellations and suspensions, or these kind of unilateral renegotiations of these contracts, where the some brands are saying, okay, well, we'll buy the orders still, but we're going to pay you only 70% of what, and without any negotiations. It said basically take it or leave it. We're going to discount 30%, 40% off of what we told you we would pay you, or you will pay you by 6 months from now. And so I think that this was, expose the extraordinary weakness of human rights due diligence, voluntary human rights due diligence. So certainly, I think in this situation, the retailers and brands had to know the consequences of what was going to happen from the cancellations, right? I don't think they made any assessment whatsoever as to what would happen once they started making those decisions, either to the suppliers, or of course to the workers, or the broader communities that relied on the income from that work. And yeah, I mean, I think you see the letters we've seen from brands to retailers weren't, oh, this is a horrible thing, let's figure out how we do this responsibly, right? Like, how do we, okay, and maybe it is that we're going to need to renegotiate some terms, but let's negotiate that, right? Let's figure out how not to have this become a major humanitarian crisis. Those weren't the letters that we've seen. Those were the letters that we saw were like, too bad, our contract says we can cancel at any time, we're canceling, goodbye, right? And that was it. So yeah, I absolutely think the human rights due diligence, if it had been applied, would have, I think, made companies responsible for having those conversations about the impact of its decision making on the workforce, and at least negotiate a path that would have mitigated the impacts, right? And maybe it couldn't have been that all this could have been avoided somehow, but certainly I think there was a responsibility for the brands to engage in at least good faith negotiations to figure out how to get through this, both with the supplier and with the worker representatives.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. You raised brilliant points on how to go on to how to deal with brands and retailers, but at the same time, I'm wondering about the factory owners, the suppliers. In this particular case, when they had the orders cancelled and orders were already halfway, do you see them able to work with these brands and suppliers later on in the future when everything is back to normal? Because you raised this point that the brands cancelled orders that were on the way or were even being shipped, and at the same time, they also demanded for more payment. So how do you see the relation between these two parties, however unequal it is in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly I would suspect that a lot of suppliers feel very cheated by this, and it's because they were. But again, I don't know to what extent that there are that many other options. I mean, if I were a supplier now, there are clearly some brands who recognized how damaging that decision was to cancel or suspend orders was, and then made a decision after a lot of campaigning to finally pay for those orders. And there were others who refused and still refused. If I was a supplier, I would probably go to the list of brands that did the right thing eventually and want to have a relationship with them. I don't know how the brands who are on the list of the non-payers will fare, but I would hope that there would be some consequence. But I imagine, just because of the asymmetries in power, both economically and legally, brands suppliers are going to need to find work, right? And so, I'm not sure that this won't just kind of replicate itself again. So, we're hoping that governments, both in where the manufacturing is taking place, as well as where the purchasing decisions are made, will kind of step in and legislate on this issue, so that you don't have the possibility of this really reckless, while maybe technically legal under the contracts, maybe it is still extraordinarily reckless, both as a human rights issue, and so that we can kind of step in and prevent these very kind of one-sided, lopsided contracts from being acceptable in the first place, right? And have means by which, for us, it would be interesting to see the workers themselves having a basis to use the contract as third-party beneficiaries, use the contract between the purchaser and the supplier to say, well, okay, but we have an interest here too, right? Like, we are making the goods, right? And the part of what you are paying for is our labor, and so we have a vested stake in you paying for those goods, right? So, but it's I don't think the law is quite yet where we need it to be. I think we're going to need to spend a good deal of time between now and hopefully there's not a next pandemic, but let's try to get the kind of get the law in place. I think it also goes back to back to basics as well. I mean, one of the reasons why this was able to happen too is that despite the best efforts of union organizers, there's still like a low union density in many countries. I think if where we had I do think if we had kind of stronger union density, I'm not saying that unions fought back in every place that they could, but I think if we had the kind of stronger unions at the national level combined with the kind of regional and international support, maybe the outcome could have been a little differently. I don't know. And then again, I think that's why we see also some suppliers also taking advantage of the situation. Say your orders are cut in half and you are a supplier that has 4 factories and 2 of them are union, right? But you only have enough orders to keep 2 factories going. Are you going to keep the union factories going or the non-union factory going? And I think we've seen in many situations that is like, oh, sorry, we're going to, everybody in the union factories, we don't have the orders anymore. We're laying you all off, and somehow there's enough to keep the non-union factories running. So we've seen this as a union busting tactic as well by the suppliers.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. That brings us to the next question. And this question goes to the fact that in our additional reading material, you mentioned that some of the suppliers were forced to downsize as a result of the order cancellations, used the pandemic as an opportunity to target union members for layoffs in the hope of scaling back or reopening union-free. I wanted you to go back to this and tell us more why firms, the suppliers would want to reopen free of unions, and what are the implications of this for workers organizing for their rights, since this is a major human rights issue. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, it's we saw this in many countries. There was an article, I think, in the New York Times that came out around Myanmar in particular, where you had, again, it may be that it's often the case that, especially when you're dealing with foreign direct investment and suppliers, a company may have multiple factories, right, that they're using to supply a particular buyer. And yeah, we saw very specifically that unions or workplaces that had unions were being specifically targeted. With the idea that obviously it's if you don't have a union, you don't have a collective agreement, it's obviously easier and cheaper to exploit labor. And that's, if you could kind of come through this process and shed unions that are in your workforce because of temporary closures, and you come back without unions, from the supplier perspective, I may say this is an overall benefit, even though I think there's obviously a strong positive to having a union and a collective bargaining agreement, even from a business perspective. But some don't see it that way and see the short-term interest. So for them, being able to kind of bust unions during the pandemic was knowing that there was going to be no labor inspection. The government certainly wasn't going to do anything about it. And the buyers are out there canceling orders, so like they're not going to pressure them. So I think some suppliers felt, well, this is a really opportune moment, even though we're in a crisis. Let's get rid of the unions while we can do it. I mean, it didn't always work because it created obviously a lot of workers fought back and kind of refused to work. I mean, there are a lot of strikes all over the world as a result of what was happening in some of these suppliers. And workers in many cases did win, but it was, I mean, and it also again goes to this question about, these companies or suppliers who, multinational enterprises that have their own codes of conduct and are proclaiming to support human rights due diligence, but then see their suppliers using this as a union busting opportunity. Why wasn't more done by the brands themselves to step in? And unfortunately, I think is usually the case. I think it's just the scale of what was happening. It made it, obviously difficult to intervene in every single case. But yeah.
Thanks, Jeff. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, Philip, and then Evelyn.
Okay, sure. Here in South Africa, okay, of course, same thing happened like everywhere else, but something more happened here in South Africa. We had, I don't know what to call it, but we had a situation where people went out looting in the shops. And then the cause of that is because of the neoliberal policies. Like, it has gone too bad. I think the cup is full. So now the cup is overflowing of the problems that are caused by neoliberal. But still, you find is the poor people who are blamed. That they are looters and so on. And then these are workers. These are formal workers. And who participate. I don't know what to say, but who were helping themselves because they're hungry. Okay. But okay, and then with the corona, so we have this company called SAB, South African Brewery, and then which used the opportunity, in my view, to pressurize the government so it can it can be protected in carrying on to make profits in an illicit way, in this country. What's happening is, okay, what's called economy of scale, the machinery that produces alcohol. It couldn't stop, apparently. They had to make a lot of alcohol every day. And this alcohol is mainly consumed by the poor of the poorest. And then it has been research, it's been found that this SAB is making a lot of money from poor communities. And then the reason poor communities are resorting into alcoholism is because of frustrations that they are faced with on a daily basis. So they get into alcohol. And then there has been suggesting like, okay, more alcohol should be taxed more, and they literally making it accessible so they can make profit, and then it can be accessible to poor of the poorest. And then when the lockdown came, the SAB complained so much, and then that
Philip,
okay.
I'll have to interrupt you.
Okay.
Could you bring out the question and we see, because I also have Evelyn on the list and I want to collect the questions.
I'm sure you understand where I was coming.
Yes.
Because alcohol, it is a problem in South Africa. Yeah. I'm sure you can help me out.
Well, no, I think you make one good point. Obviously, I was talking about workers in the garment industry, which are in informal employment, and as you mentioned, I think this impact on workers in the informal economy was even more severe. So that was, I think, a good point to raise. But yeah, I think the situation you raised at the brewery is, very similar to what we see in another, many other industries, many other countries that, take advantage of crises, right? So this is something we've seen, I think, a number of countries do. Companies and countries and businesses. In a number of countries, we saw governments stepping in instead of trying to bolster labor laws and social protection and these things, like actually rolled them back, put limitations on freedom of association. Some kind of there are a couple of cases where the governors of certain Indian states try to eliminate the labor law entirely. So yeah, I think we saw a number of cases where governments took advantage of this. I would imagine in good part at the behest of business to weaken labor standards and labor rights. And companies that may legitimately be suffering somewhat from the COVID pandemic, finding ways in which they could restructure their situation in a way that's most advantageous to themselves, regardless of how it may impact workers or communities. So I think what you explained is, like you said, I think is typical of the way we've seen some industries respond, some governments respond. Some obviously have done the opposite thing. They've I think tried to shore up social protection. Some companies have come in and done the right thing, but I think more often than not, I think we've seen the crisis being used to their advantage against the interests of workers. I don't know if that answered your question, but I think I responded to it.
Thanks, Jeff. Evelyn also has a question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeffrey. I'm just looking at the issue of targeting of trade union leaders. And I'm also looking at the provisions of ILO. At what point, because we saw India government and some states in India actually suspending some of the labor rights and labor laws in the name of pandemic. What are the current provisions of ILO in terms of that scenario where government can actually hide behind pandemic to suspend some of the labor rights, including collective bargaining agreements? And what are the remedies that actually the labor movement can learn from this current pandemic in terms of negotiating at ILO so that we are able to safeguard the workers' interests, even if there's another outbreak? Because for me, that is critical. What are the provisions? What are the mechanisms? And what opportunities do we have as labor unions as a result of the pandemic to strengthen some of the ILO conventions, especially in terms of pandemic, so that the employers do not take advantage of the situation?
All right. I'm going to put in the chat here. A colleague of mine, Ruan Sibasinghe, who's at the ITF, and I wrote a short piece in Equal Times about this very thing. So I put it in the chat. Let me put to everyone. But yeah, I mean, I think if you say the way the ILO has responded to this is, yeah, I mean, fundamental rights are fundamental rights, regardless of whether you're in a pandemic or not, right? It may be in some cases that there may be temporary limitations, like you wouldn't want to have thousands of people, in the early days of the pandemic, thousands of people massed on the street, such in a way that it become kind of a super spreader event. But there are also ways in which you could, but that doesn't mean that you severely limit freedom of association entirely, right? Which was happening. Or they would do it in a selective way. They would say, like, no meetings of more than 10 people. But they would say, but we're still keeping factories open, and workers are still having to cram themselves into buses to get to their workplace, right? And then they get to the workplace, and the assembly lines were not socially distanced. They weren't provided personal protective equipment. So on the one hand, they say, well, you can't possibly meet if you're more than 10, but we're going to make you work in situations and get to your work in situations that are even more dangerous, right? So it was obviously called into question, how concerned are they really about public health, and how concerned are they about workers not meeting together and talking about how they respond to this, right? So I think that's what we saw quite often happen. And yeah, I think both the ILO conventions and general international law do recognize that while there are can be exceptions for public emergencies where you can have temporary limits, these have to be proportionate, and certainly you can't just ban strikes or ban this or ban that if it is really not at all necessary to address the specific problem that's in front of you. So it's short. I would recommend reading that article we had in Equal Times. I think that lays out the legal arguments around it.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Anyone else with a question, a comment?
Just to say that I just added to Jeff's resource to the further readings of the chapter. So whoever misses it here can.
Great, Edira, thank you. So maybe Jeff, you could comment Okay, I'll just ask a very short question. You could comment on brand shaming, whether that could work to force brands like IKEA, H&M, and the ones that have not signed, that cancelled or did not put into effect the contracts and agreements that they had signed. So even, yeah, that was my question. It's quite short. And Evelyn and Gifford, maybe you just add your questions and then Jeff can answer all at once.
Yeah, maybe a quick one. I'm just wondering, at the point where the brand or the buyer decides to suspend the provisions of fulfilling their part of the contract because of force majeure, am I, as a supplier, allowed to sell the same merchandise to another corporation, another brand? Because what I need to do is simply remove the brand name and maybe tag another one. So what are the legal implications? You've decided to terminate the contract because of force majeure. Do I still have the obligation to continue supplying you that? Or if another buyer comes in, I'm allowed to actually do that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know fully the answer to that. I have seen some of the contracts which say, even in the case of a cancellation, that the goods are still property of the buyer, so that it would not be able to unload those shirts or whatever on another buyer. I mean, I think it would also depend on how, if anything is obviously carries the intellectual property, which is not only the tag but the design. I'm not sure that would be easy to do, but I'm sorry, I don't technically know the answer, but my guess is it would be very difficult for that supplier to be able to unload those garments elsewhere. The other question, I'm sorry, I've blanked on it.
Was about brand shaming, and
yeah.
there was Gifford wanted to have a question as well. Maybe he could
I
just cut in
quickly. Let me just add this, and maybe you could do them together. You mentioned strikes by garment workers, and I've heard of some, but could you give us just an example of one that you found most inspiring that had any level of success, in a place of production where garment workers did strike against these, like you said, the cancellation of contracts that really left them out?
Yeah. So brand shaming, yes, I think it was effective. We were able to get the workers in a coordinated campaign were able to get a number of brands to agree to pay for the orders, and yeah, I mean, I think certain brands don't, the ones that are more publicly known certainly didn't want to be on any sort of blacklist where they were kind of known as the company that really, turned their backs on workers during the pandemic. We would want to hope that we can create a system at some point that doesn't require like this one-on-one campaigning all the time, and that we're able to hold brands accountable in a more direct way without having to go through all this every time. But it did work. I think as far as strikes, yeah, I would say what I've seen in Myanmar over the last couple of years, both during the COVID pandemic and obviously post-coup, has been extraordinary. Workers, who are, at that point been only a few, it's been, unfortunately, there was a democratic window of about 10 years, right? But in that point, really organized, and seeing videos of young women workers in garment factories just kind of right on the floor there, like organizing, and then just kind of marching on the boss's office and said, we will not continue working under these conditions, and they were able to shut factories down, and were, I think, very effective. So I'm sure there are equally good stories in many other countries, but I was just in part because was visually able to see a lot of this. There's just the strategy and the courage of these workers to just be able to like know what their rights were, know what they wanted, and were completely unified and at the factory level to make it happen.
Okay, looks like we're at the end. You didn't really comment on the brand shaming, whether it could be a remedy, but maybe.
Oh yeah, I mean, I thought I did. It did. The brand shaming did. I think it worked in getting payments down to the suppliers. I think the big question is, and I don't think we know the answer to it, is even when the brands paid for the orders, and I don't know if we have an easy way to track this, and I doubt we do, is then did the suppliers, once they receive the money, pay the workers, especially the workers who at that point no longer had an employment relationship with the brand or with the supplier at that point. So that's not entirely clear, but all the more reason it's important to have unions to make sure that that does happen.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you, our participants. We had a last question about the issue of contracts that were terminated and not compensated, but that will be covered in our next workshop. This is a small advertisement. Right. On Wednesday, we'll have a workshop that will specifically cover this topic. So please come by, and thank you for coming today.